Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a gross kind of day here in suburban Chicago. It is March 20th. It's a drizzly day, so it is literally raining on me right now. You may catch the occasional pick of raindrops pattering off of my rain jacket. Hopefully it's not so annoying as to ruin the recording. I guess the road noise from cars will also be a bit more aggressive than usual. But it's also in the 40s, and it's March, so it feels like spring. We're in this weird place, if you live in the Midwest, where some days are cold enough that as of today you're still wearing hat and gloves, and other days the sun is out and you feel like summer is just around the corner. There's a phrase that says April showers bring May flowers, but I find March is the springiest month, usually in the Midwest. By the time we get to April, the weather is turned and it really feels like almost summer for the most part. March is the season of change in my view. I guess April is the season of springing. March is the beginning of spring, as far as I am concerned. So with that in mind, I thought I would do today an episode of our Board Game Sommelier. As you recall, Board Game Sommelier is a segment where I pick a theme and I choose some media to engage with, to read, or to watch, and then a board game that captures a similar feeling. If you check the show notes for today, I will provide links to my other Board Game Sommelier episodes. I believe I did a zombies one and a winter one. So now we have the spring one. I imagine I have two more built-in segments, a summer and a fall, before I have to think of something else to do. So with that in mind, let's jump right in. As I thought about spring, I thought about a variety of different things, but mostly I think about what are the different feelings or ideas that spring brings to mind as I ponder the season. And I use those as the starting points for my conversation here. So to begin with, given the walk that I'm having here, I thought of rain. Spring always feels like a time when at any moment the sky could be raining, but it's usually a drifting kind of drizzly rain, an enriching rain rather than a tempestuous rain. The hard, violent rainstorms of the summer aren't here yet. It's going to be usually drizzles or a kind of smattering that feels like it's nature reminding the earth that it's time to wake up and plants to bloom. With that in mind, I thought I was trying to think of films where rain plays a crucial part, and I couldn't think of very many. There are certainly movies that use rain. Rain is one of the big expressionist tools of the film world ever since the 20s, when German expressionist filmmakers came over and started making films in America, and they started bringing with them the idea that from romantic literature that the nature should reflect feelings, which is where we get a thing like anytime there's a funeral in a movie, it's always raining too, which doesn't really fit with the pattern of real life, but makes for a good film because rain makes us all sad in some ways. But rain also signifies a cleansing, a rebirth. And so I thought the movie where rain was the biggest signifier for me, the biggest symbol, is the movie The Shawshank Redemption. If you haven't seen it, it's about a man unjustly sent to prison who finds a life in prison and seeks to grow and live despite the injustice he's faced. It's a great movie. Starring Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. If you haven't seen it, well worth a watch. But there's a really significant scene that includes rain, and so it's with rain that I associate this first segment of spring. So what games do I have that could associate with rain? Or in this case, I was thinking of water and flooding. And I have one in mind, Forbidden Island. It's part of a series of games by Matt Leacock where players work together to try to solve a problem cooperatively, and the game itself sort of works against them. In Forbidden Island, as in Pandemic, the deck gets shuffled and put back on top, meaning the cards that have flooded before will flood again. And so you're consistently trying to beat back the tide of the rain or the flooding that's trying to stop you from stealing the magical treasures off the island. It's a delightful little game, a really good introduction for people who've never played cooperative games before, a little more forgiving than Pandemic, and a little more fun if you're playing with younger people than the theme of Pandemic. So that would be my choice of a game to go with a rain movie, although it really doesn't necessarily pair well with Shawshank Redemption. If I were looking at a broader selection of games throughout the game landscape, if I had access to a well-stocked game store as well as my own collection, I might suggest two other games that have to do with flooding, and that's Pandemic Netherlands, I think it's called, in which you're actually trying to hold back the floods out of the Netherlands. And then Lowlands, which is also, I believe, set in the Netherlands. It's about sheep farming, but there's a dike that everybody has to maintain, and if it isn't properly maintained, then it floods the lowlands and various kinds of bad stuff happens. So that's the first of the segments. I better move faster if I want to get through them all. The second characteristic of spring, I would say this comes in early April after the rains have gone, and that's the idea of blooming. Nature is, of course, reviving at this time. The winter is over. If you're in the northern hemisphere, the earth is tipping back toward the sun, and we're getting warmer weather. And so all of the plants that go through life cycles in the winter and hibernate or die, they come back in the spring, and we have a blooming of nature. Trees will be budding, plants will start flowering, and nature sort of wakes up here in spring. So I was thinking about what games best capture this feeling of growth, of blooming and plants, and what's a film we can watch that captures that well. For films, I think Wild America, the old television show about nature, really captures this well. It mostly focuses on animals rather than plants, because it's kind of hard to make an exciting show about plants. But it still feels like nature being celebrated, and I think is a worthy viewing option. As a game player, you have a couple options, particularly with regard to plants. The game Photosynthesis would be one I could point out. I don't know that I have any in my collection that fit this model very well. I would say, Reykholt. Reykholt was the one I was going to say. Even though this is growing plants in a greenhouse, it still functions like a blooming. It feels like blooming, because a big part of what you're doing is building up an engine that just generates more and more plants. And so as the game goes along, in the first round, you can barely scrape together one cauliflower. By the third round or fourth round, you're paying 3 or 4 cauliflowers at a time and still have some left over. It's a delightful little system that really makes you feel like plants are blooming. I love it. So that would be one from my collection. But if you wanted more plant-focused games, I would say Photosynthesis is one. Arboretum is another one. These are both actually pretty competitive games. Maybe points to the dark side of blooming, where my growing blocks you with a shadow. The third idea that I wanted to point to in thinking about spring is the idea of newborns. Spring is, of course, the time of rebirthed plant life, but also the rebirthed animal life. That our symbols of spring are often baby animals, baby chicks, baby bunnies, and the idea that as we come out of winter, this is the time the animals recognize as a productive time to bear children, and so baby animals are everywhere. The two games, the film that I would suggest here would be thinking about The Human Animal the documentary Babies, which documents the birth and early life of 3 babies, I think, in different locations, would be an interesting way to wrestle with this question of what does it mean for us to continue life on this planet and how do we engage with it. As for games, Uwe Rosenberg really has me captured here. I would suggest Agricola, despite being a difficult game where you really have to focus on feeding your family, is also a really satisfying endeavor in terms of figuring out how to get more animals. And a big part of that game is getting 2 of the same animals so that you can get baby animals, and getting to the point where you can have more children. Both of those are a fundamental part of the game, and really, when you first get your first baby in that game, so you have another worker, or when you get a thing going where you have animals producing other animals, it's really satisfying. Now, if you want the boiled down version of that, there is Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, which is just animal husbandry. It gets rid of the other elements that make the other game longer and more complex, but also a bit more punishing. It gets rid of the feeding your family aspect of the game. So that's the idea of new birth, or being of newborns in spring. I would say those are the ways I would suggest engaging with it. And finally, the last thing I would point to is the idea of, actually I have 2 more. The idea of spring being frantic. As life comes alive, animals are quickly trying to make their space in the world, quickly trying to find food for their new babies that have been born, and it's the frantic birth of life. And so I think there's also an element of joy to it. I'd rather have it be joy than chaos. And so rather than pointing to any kind of movie about struggle, I would say a frantic movie that's a comedy would work well. So Clue or Noises Off are my 2 favorite farces. I think farce is the genre here that seems to embody the franticness of spring in a joyful way. So if you haven't seen either of those films, they're both great. Clue, I'd say, is a little better. These are movies. It doesn't really matter what the movies are about. The excitement of them is the rat-a-tat dialogue between the characters, the fast interplay of sequences, the witty repartee. These are all delightful, and frantic is the word I would use for them. Particularly the last 20 or 30 minutes of Clue are hilariously frantic. For gameplay, I can think of 2 games that I would point to as frantic. One from my collection, Escape: Curse of the Temple, is not funny, but it is very frantic. You're trying to get through these obstacles, you're hurrying as quick as you can, you're trying to work with other people. It's delightful and chaotic and frantic. If you're looking for something that's a bit more pleasant or fun in theme, as well as being frantic, and you're willing to go outside my collection, I would point to a game that was heavily reviewed a couple years ago, and this is Magic Maze. This is a game where you have a group of heroes that's trying to move through a labyrinth, a maze that's actually a shopping mall, to try to get some items and get out. And the big thing is that each player can move any of the characters, but they can only do one kind of move. Like, it can only move west, or they can only turn the character or something. And other players can only do some other move. And so the idea is you have to take turns moving the characters so that you can get them through a particular thing using your power that only you can do. And the trick, of course, is you're not allowed to talk. So it's frantic because you're constantly trying to get other people to help you with your tasks or help other people with their tasks. But you have to kind of gain people's attention. So that's frantic. Finally, as a sort of coda here, I will point to the word for the spring equinox is the vernal equinox. I'm sure that's Latin, but I wanted to point to it because one of my favorite slapstick comedians when I was a child was a man named Jim Varney, who was famous for doing a lovable doofus character named Ernest P. Worrell, who started by appearing in local television commercials and became a spokesperson for Sprite for a while. And he always was talking to his neighbor, Vern. And when I think of the vernal equinox, what I really think of is Ernest P. Worrell. So I would recommend to go with the idea of vernal. Watch Ernest's best movie, the child-friendly Ernest Goes to Camp, which was a favorite of mine when I was a kid. It doesn't hold up great. It's not a great movie, but it's an amusing one nonetheless. And then second, in terms of games, I would say the embodiment of Ernest P. Worrell as a game is the hilarious 5-minute joy fest that is Happy Salmon. If you've never played Happy Salmon, it's a great little delight of a game. Excellent icebreaker or filler, and definitely worth trying out. So, what are some themes that you can think of that tie to spring? And how would you, what films and games would you tie to them? Pop by Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know what your thoughts are. Join the conversation there. Otherwise, I look forward to next time I see you. And until then, I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.